I'm Kevin Davis. This is the Catholic Family Podcast. I'm happy to be joined again, and perhaps for the last time, second to last time on this series, by Mr. Louie Verrecchio of akacatholic.com. Now, hopefully that's not the last time ever. We love Louie. We hope Louie comes on the show for the until the end of time. We hope he comes on the show. But this series has been covering the documents of the Second Vatican Council. It's one of my favorite series we've ever done. I think it's so full of information, and I'm not kidding when I say this. It's not hyperbole. I leave every show with my head like full of knowledge and almost bursting, kind of like, oh my goodness, what did I just learn? And I did come to it. I came to it honestly fairly as a newbie. I'm a traditional Catholic, but I didn't really study the Vatican documents. I admit it, and it's been a lot to learn. I knew some of the stuff, but the things I've learned has been absolutely shocking. So anyone who's just jumping in today, please go watch all of the episodes. You don't need to. Maybe you need to watch the first episode of this document, the Gaudium at Spes. I'm sure that will help you to understand where we're coming from. Maybe the introduction video. Also, there is a playlist for this entire series, so please, after you're done with this one, go check out all of the videos. They're fantastic. Louie has done such a good job of putting them together, putting time into it. And if you like what you see today, go check out Louie's website, akacatholic.com. Today, again, we're covering part 2 of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, as promulgated by His Holiness Pope Paul VI on December 7th, 1965. Now, in part 1, I'll let Louie do more of the kind of the wrap up of what we talked about, but it had a lot to do with baptism, and pretty much, as far as I remember it, we recorded it a couple of weeks ago, but it's kind of like, baptism, do you really need to? Do you really need to? Do you need to be Catholic? Do you need to be baptized? That's kind of my impression of it. That's my very, 5-year-old brain impression of it. So Louie, I'll let you take it away and tell us exactly what we learned. Maybe wrap that up from part 1, and then I guess we'll continue into part 2 of Gaudium et Spes.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be back with you. I think that's a fair assessment of the punchline, if you will, to this entire document, and that is the absence of any mention whatsoever of baptism. This document, just like the other documents that we've covered, it speaks as if, every man is good to go, whether he's Christian or not, baptized or not. And this document is right in line with that conciliar theme. And it's going to continue in part 2 of our examination today. And I want to pick this one up by looking again a little bit more closely at Article 29, which we touched on last week, which stated this: all men have been redeemed by Christ and enjoy the same divine calling and destiny. Now, we touched on this in our examination last week, and we noted the emphasis that was added to this teaching by John Paul II, who said, every man without any exception whatever has been redeemed by Christ. Now, the problem with this statement lies in the fact that while Christ's work of redemption is sufficient to redeem all of humanity, indeed it's superabundantly so, it's not the case that all men have been redeemed on an individual basis, as if it's just a done deal. To remove any confusion at all that might still exist among some viewers, I think it might be helpful for us to consider Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, where we find the following, quote, we may regard the redemption objectively or subjectively. Objectively, the redemption is the work of the Redeemer. Subjectively, the redemption is the realization of the redemption in individual men or the application of the fruits of the redemption to individual men. End quote. Now, as for whether or not redemption is realized in individual men, Ott goes on to say this: the work of redemption must consist in the turning away from the creature and the turning towards God. End quote. Now, what Ott's describing here is critically important. Namely, he's talking about the role of free will with respect to redemption. One must accept the fruits of redemption, right, in order for them to be realized. And along the way, the simplest, most straightforward definition of redemption that I saw, at any rate, is the one that's given in the Catholic Encyclopedia. And it tells us that redemption is the restoration of man from the bondage of sin to the liberty of the children of God through the satisfactions and merits of Christ. Now, I know that's a mouthful. And as for how the merits of redemption are bestowed in individual men, God explains this in his treatment of Adam's sin and man's subsequent bondage to sin as a result. And he says this, quote, "It is removed by the merits of the redemption of Jesus Christ, which are bestowed through the sacrament of baptism." So with all of this said, hopefully it's now a little bit clearer to viewers why no pope, no true pope, nor any authentic exercise of the supreme magisterium of the Holy Catholic Church would ever cavalierly declare that every man, without any exception whatever, has been redeemed. Past tense, done deal. It's just not going to come from the church, okay? Because doing so invites one to imagine, just like you said, Kevin, that baptism is essentially unnecessary, which is precisely the message conveyed in the entirety of this 3,500-word text that fails to mention baptism even once.
Well, and it always strikes me, I always have to think of like St. Francis Xavier, going and truly risking his life, or the so many of the different, missionaries who went out through the world and risked their lives, and many of them got killed in order to spread the word of God and to baptize the souls. And it doesn't just strike you that it's kind of like, just imagine the Pope of the time being like, yeah, they're saved. Christ died on the cross. It sounds so Protestant too. It's just incredible. It really is. Like, again, when you put it this, succinctly, it can't be the same faith. It can't be the same faith of St. Francis Xavier. Can't.
Yeah, most certainly isn't. And last week I provided a quote from the biography of Fulton J. Sheen, who said something along the lines of that in speaking to missionaries, he always talks to them about how they're not so much called to bring Christ to the people, but to draw Christ out of the people, which is it's part and parcel of what we find in Gaudium et Spes, where it states that Christ is in some way united with every man and that his human nature has been raised to a divine dignity. Well, if that's true, then what Fulton J. Sheen said is correct. And as we speak, the news is that the beatification of Sheen is coming quickly. So the Vatican II Church continues to anoint its own as saints, and, we should expect he's going to be sainted one of these days. And I like to refer to that process in the conciliar church as not canonization, but the bestowing of the Lifetime Conciliar Achievement Award for service to the revolution. That's what it really is. Anyway, moving on in the text today, I'm going to jump into Article 24, which says this, and I apologize for the length of this quote. "Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one," this is in John 17, "this opened up vistas closed to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself." End quote. Now, there's a lot of words here, but we're going to pick them apart a little bit. So first thing I want you to note is that the unity of God's sons, as spoken by the council here, if we understand it in context, this refers to all men, not just the baptized, but also the unbaptized. But as we noted previously, its baptism is what imparts the grace of adoption. That's what makes one a child of God. Also note that the captains of the ecumenical movement in the conciliar church, they often quote these very same words of our Lord in John 17, that all may be one as we are one. And in response to that, people like us often criticize them for suggesting that the Catholic Church is laboring for unity, when the fact of the matter is unity is a note of the one true Church of Christ that she can never lose. But if we consider this statement from Gaudium et Spes number 24 closely, what we'll discover here is that the Council's view of unity isn't specifically Christian unity, but rather the unity of all men, meaning the heretic, the heathen, the Muslim, the Jew, whomever. That is the context in which Gaudium et Spes is quoting Jesus in John 17. And the unity of which the Council speaks is manifested not in the unity of faith, charity, and governance as it is in the Catholic Church, but rather in joint ventures that are aimed at reaching certain social justice goals, right? So this is an example of why it's so important to apply this hermeneutic of cohesion and allowing the Council to define the words that it uses rather than simply assuming that what the council means by some familiar words that are used in Catholic theology that they mean the same thing in the council's view. They very often do not, and this is a case where that's certainly so. Notice as well that this article states that, quote, man is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself. At this, viewers might recall our last episode where we cited the First Vatican Council text, De Filius, which stated this in one of its canons. If anyone denies that the world and all things which are contained in it were created for the glory of God, let him be anathema. The notion that God willed the human creature for itself, it's essentially a denial of what is taught in De Filius of Vatican I. And what did that council say of those who do so? Let him be anathema. That is, let that person or those persons be considered outside the society of the faithful. That's what anathema means. And so here we have yet another good reason for people of goodwill to conclude that Vatican Council II is not an act of the supreme magisterium of the Holy Catholic Church. It simply can't be. Moving on now to Article 26, we find the following quote. There is a growing awareness of the exalted dignity proper to the human person, since he stands above all things, and his rights and duties are universal and inviolable. End quote. Enumerating certain of these rights, the article, just as we might expect, it cites, quote, rightful freedom, even in matters religious. Now, this isn't the only place in Gaudium et Spes where the right to religious freedom is mentioned. For example, Article 73. Those political systems prevailing in some parts of the world are to be reproved, which hamper civic or religious freedom. End quote. Now, a newcomer to this text might look at that and say, yeah, that sounds reasonable. We need religious freedom so that we can be Catholics without being hamstrung by our government. But you need to understand that religious freedom is mentioned in Gaudium et Spes to be understood as it's set forth in Dignitatis Humanae, one of the other documents that we covered in this series on religious freedom. Now, this seems obvious, but I mentioned only to underscore once again the importance of this hermeneutic of cohesion. You have to allow the council to tell us what these words mean. You can't assume that they mean what a Catholic would think they would mean in 1955, for example. Reiterating its unbridled esteem for man, which is one of the themes of this document, the council says in Article 27, coming down to practical and particularly urgent consequences, this council lays stress on reverence for man. Reverence for man. So think about what the council's doing here. It's about to address certain matters of urgency that are facing humanity as they met. And rather than stressing reverence for Christ the King, it plainly admits to laying stress on reverence for man. And so what is reverence? Well, the Catholic definition is that it's a type of veneration, right? That expresses the honor that's due to God ultimately. So, for example, when we venerate or show reverence for sacred images or relics or even individual persons, like priests and bishops and popes, we do so by virtue of their close relationship with God, because doing so points to Him. Nowhere that I could find in the preconciliar magisterium, and again, I'm open to correction if I have this wrong, could I find even one instance of the church encouraging indiscriminate reverence for mankind. So imagine showing reverence toward an abortionist, a Satanist, a child molester. I mean, it's utterly preposterous, but this is the nature of the council's unbridled adoration, if you will, of man and his soaring dignity.
Well, and isn't it there's got to be something where there's I suppose a reverence for what they can be, what they should be. I mean, we all have this spark of God in us, right? A soul, but also fallen, right? I guess it is kind of that strange thing that we have that real. It seems like this disconnect with this document where it doesn't seem to understand that point. It seems much more Protestant, where it's just like, yeah, it's all good. Just have faith. If you try, you're fine. You're fine. Again, as you said many times in the last show, baptism, do you need it for salvation? Maybe. Yeah, not really. Amazing.
Now, this is in perfect keeping with what the what are they calling now, the dicastery for the destruction of the faith in the conciliar church, where they came out a couple years ago with this document about infinite dignity, the infinite dignity of humankind without any discretion or distinction whatsoever. Well, obviously that's not true. It is appropriate to reverence, in a way, some men. The priest. Why? Not because he's such a great guy, but because he's configured to Jesus Christ, the high priest. So it's just nonsense, this blanket adoration for man. It's stunning, even just from a logical standpoint. A non-Catholic would look at this and say, I beg your pardon, I don't honor the child molester in the same way that I do the person who's an upstanding citizen who actually does good in society, right? And keep in mind that the council is stating this, it's laying stress on reverence for man after already having declared in Article 12 that we addressed in our last episode that all things on earth should be related to man as their center and crown. So it just keeps getting worse. Now, if that's not enough, further along in Article 35, we're told this, quote, human activity, to be sure, takes its significance from its relationship to man. Just as it proceeds from man, so it is ordered toward man. So much for doing all things, even menial things, seemingly small things, for the glory of God, right? That's what I was taught, and that's what I continue to hear in traditional settings, is that this is how we're supposed to live our life. It's for the glory of God. It's not ordered toward man and gains its significance from its relationship to man. That's just pure humanism. Gaudium et Spes went on to list various things that, quote, violate the integrity of the human person. And many of the things that it listed are things that we can agree on. Mutilation, torments inflicted on the body or the mind, in other words, torture, slavery, prostitution, and so on. But tucked into this list, however, and without any qualifying statements at all, is, get this, deportation. Deportation. And so maybe this is why men like Leo and Francis before him, they speak as if there are no circumstances whatsoever under which deportation is justified. So as you've said many times, Kevin, all roads lead back to this council,
Well, it's fascinating too. And I had to shout out your channel again, because you also on your YouTube channel, you're kind of covering what Leo the 14th is talking about also in his terms of Vatican II, which is good timing. So we thank him for that. It definitely works out with this show and has gotten us plenty of views. And again, everyone, I highly recommend you going and just Google Louie's name or YouTube it, search it on YouTube, and you'll find his response to that series, because I think it is, again, it's so fitting. And you see it right with Leo right now. He is pretty much basing his faith upon Vatican II. Right? I mean, basically, that's what it seems like. So if that's the case, how important is it for everyone to understand these documents, especially those who see something in Leo and in Rome and say, hey, something's wrong? Well, here you go. Here you go. Go and see these documents, and you're going to see, again, as we said a million times, the roots of what's happening.
Absolutely. And little spoiler alert, I hope to publish my response to this week's catechesis on the conciliar documents of Leo tomorrow. Nice. Maybe Saturday if I can't quite get it done.
So that will be the 16th or 17th of January, depending on when we publish it. So it might be, once you see this video, that might be published already. So go check that out on Louie's YouTube channel. It depends on when we publish this video. So again, Louie Verrecchio on YouTube, go look it up. Good stuff.
Yeah, and interestingly, Kevin, even though he's talking about the document De Verbum, once again, we see a stunning absence of any mention of baptism, where it's entirely appropriate in order to give a Catholic presentation on what he's saying. So the theme continues. Now, looking back now to Article 29, where we opened up this episode, did you notice that it says that all men enjoy the same divine calling and destiny? Destiny. So that statement is only half correct. All men are called to eternal life with God, but certainly not all men are destined to realize it. And much has been made of conciliar churchmen who say that hell might be empty, or that there's reasonable hope that hell is empty, or in other words, that all may be saved. Well, once again, if you're wondering where they got that idea, you look no further than Vatican Council II, and in this case, Gaudium et Spes, Article 29. And its claim that all men, without distinction, enjoy the same destiny. And by the way, this word enjoy, every now and then when I'm going through the English text of these documents, I feel compelled to just double check to make sure it's a reasonable translation of the Latin. Not that I'm a Latinist, but you can figure these things out. And it ends up, it's a good translation. The Latin word that's used means to enjoy, but it can also mean to delight in or to profit by. And so it's entirely clear what destiny the council is referring to here. It's eternal beatitude. And clearly that's not all men's destiny, unless, of course, all men are saved, right? Still in this same Article 29, we're told, quote, "For in truth, it must still be regretted that fundamental personal rights are still not being universally honored. Such is the case of a woman who is denied the right to choose a husband freely." End quote. Now, that sounds like a very reasonable statement, but it called to my mind Hinduism, which considers the highest form of marriage to be when a man's parents choose a suitable spouse for their son. Okay. Years ago, this is probably the reason why this jumped out at me. I used to work with a man whose marriage was arranged in this way. He was an immigrant from India and he's a Hindu. And this couple seemed very happy. They had a child together and they were thriving, it appeared, from my vantage point. And incidentally, the divorce rate among these Hindu marriages is less than 1%, whereas so-called Christians in the U.S. divorce at a rate of over 40%. Now, I'm not suggesting here that arranged marriages are the way to go, but I am simply pointing out the sheer hypocrisy of the conciliar church because it expresses its great esteem for Hindus. And it's even praises Hinduism by name in Nostra Aetate, another document that we covered. And so this is what you get when a society, this conciliar church, is unmoored from objective truth. It's capable of saying and doing just about anything, contradicting itself at every turn. This is just another example of that. Kevin and Spes has a whole lot more to say about marriage, as we're going to find out. And spoiler alert again, it's not exactly Catholic, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that. Staying in Article 29, which obviously is a doozy, we're told this: "For excessive economic and social differences between the members of the one human family or population groups cause scandal." End quote. Now, this indictment of social differences between men it's a concrete example of what was mentioned in the last episode. Namely, the council's suggestion that differences in class are condemnable and should in some way be eliminated. But as we noted in the last episode, Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X after him taught we must preserve the diversity of classes, which is assuredly the attribute of a soundly constituted state. And so, again, another example that this thing can't be Catholic. It's contradictory of what came before it. Throughout this text, Gaudium et Spes insists upon mankind's autonomy, which to me immediately called to mind the fall and the sin of Adam, right? That was an exercise in seeking an autonomy that wasn't his own. Now, this word autonomy, it appears throughout the text. It factors very heavily in Gaudium et Spes. It's there more than 20 times. But we're just going to highlight a couple of examples for some context. In Article 36, for example, the council clarifies what it means by autonomy, stating this: "If by the autonomy of earthly affairs we mean that created things and societies themselves enjoy their own laws and values, which must be gradually deciphered, put to use and regulated by men, that it is entirely right to demand that autonomy." End quote. So what is autonomy of earthly affairs, if you think about it, other than disregard for the sovereign rights of Christ the King? That's what I'm hearing. And I think
autonomy from what else, right? I mean, I guess I just don't quite understand. It's like what from the animals? From what? I may have the autonomy from like what else could it be? It's just kind of bizarre. This whole thing. It's kind of talking about this. Men have the rights to do this, and this, based on from what? Like what are you talking about? Like what are they? Are you saying they don't have that because something's stopping them? Again, what's stopping them? The dogs, the pigs, the horses. I mean, no, obviously not. So they have to be talking about God, I guess. It's bizarre. Again, I told you, Louis, at the beginning of the show, these always blow my mind. It's like, what are they talking about?
Yeah, that's a great point, Kevin. I mean, that's just the next logical question in the face of someone demanding autonomy. What are you asking to be freed from? What constraints are you trying to break free of? Well, you named it. It is Almighty God. I mean, because the thing that should be ordering our affairs is the sovereign rights of Christ the King come first, right? So again, this is just all part of the council's overall dethronement of Jesus Christ. In Article 55, we're told this: throughout the whole world, there is a mounting increase in the sense of autonomy as well as of responsibility. This is of paramount importance, which becomes more clear if we consider the unification of the world and the duty which is imposed upon us. Now, let's pause here to note this phrase, the unification of the world. Again, unity can only be achieved one way, right? Before the council, it was clear how you establish unity among men. It's truly in the Catholic Church, right? The council describes what it considers to be the duty which is imposed upon us. And that's namely, quote, this is remarkable, that we build a better world based on truth and justice, that we are witnesses of the birth of a new humanism, one in which man is defined, first of all, by this responsibility to his brothers and to history. Where is the responsibility and the duty that men have toward God? It's missing. And viewers will remember in our last episode that we cited Paul VI's address to the council on December 7th, 1965, the day before its formal closing, where he touted the council's new humanism. And so here we get a sense for exactly what that entails. Gaudium et Spes says we have a duty to build a better world based on truth and justice. And it says this without any reference to Jesus Christ, who is the truth, of course. So what is truth and justice? I guess it's up to men with their autonomy to define what that is. Now, hopefully at this point, viewers aren't sick and tired of hearing me repeat the Catholic recipe for this, truth and justice, as taught by Pius XI in Quas Primas. This is unattainable. Truth and justice cannot be attained unless and until men recognize both in public and in private life that Jesus Christ is King, and to render unto him the honor that he's due.
I mean, if you just think about it basically, right, from our basic catechism, I mean, we can reason that there is a God, that we were made by God to serve God, and that we have a church given to us by God to help us serve God, right? That's just the basics, really. I mean, in one sentence, right, about our faith. And if that's the case, it just boggles my mind where you're thinking about this and you're like, okay, so the Catholic Church, that's the basics of what they teach. And then they add on to that an addendum where they say, but let's make it more human. Actually, so, you remember that whole thing about God and about how God, made us and how we should serve him, and he gave us a church to serve him. Actually, no, let's put that to the side and let's actually humanize this whole thing. They actually use the word humanize, Louis. I mean, what are we doing? Unbelievable. This stuff is it blows my mind.
It is. And well, in a sense, you have to give the council credit because even though it's often accused of ambiguity, when you get right down to it, it's not ambiguous at all.
No, it's not.
They're putting forth a new humanism that doesn't have room for God in the manner in which you spoke or in which I described with our duty toward Christ the King. The council doesn't teach this. And so we're left to conclude that its concept of building a better world can only be understood as does Masonry understand such things, which I mention again, Masonry itself is a creation of Talmudism and the Kabbalistic concept of tikkun olam, which literally means repairing the world. Okay. Now, I've alluded several times in this series to Vatican II and its assault on Catholic doctrine as being in some large measure the product of undue Jewish influence. And so with this in mind, viewers might be interested in knowing that a small minority of self-identified Jews globally are actively awaiting the coming of a Messiah, right? Most estimates top out somewhere around 20%. The other 80%, Messiah, they have no room for that. So-called Reform Jews, which happen to be the largest denomination of self-identified Jews in the United States, they openly teach that it makes no sense to await a flesh and blood Messiah. Rather, it's up to them to make the world a better place. And that's exactly what is meant by this tikkun olam. And I think it's no coincidence that this is the same principle that has been adopted by the council. Kevin, you wanted to say something?
No, I'm just flummoxed. I just say, wow. I mean, I didn't know that about the Jews, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What more could I say? Yeah. Wow.
Well,
Amazing.
based on, look, there's a lot of sinners who are behaving badly in this world, but if you look at that group as a whole, I mean, their behavior as a whole does not demonstrate striving for holiness to prepare the ground for the coming of the promised Messiah. No, it's that you and I are the Messiah. That's the message of Reformed Judaism.
It's an interesting point, Louis. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if you look at the Bible and you imagine Christ coming into Jerusalem, and you imagine it probably was something like that, the 20%, or maybe it was more, maybe it was 40% of the people really did, view Christ as something, at least maybe not necessarily the Messiah, but they viewed him as something good, as a good change, as someone coming to tell them something that they wanted to hear. And I guess it was the other, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% that had him crucified. That's an interesting thing, because I bet you that kind of connects with the historical version of the Jews. That is wow, fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so you get the sense, really, in the scriptures, that to be a Jew was to be awaiting the Messiah. It was no such thing as being part of the people Israel and not awaiting a Messiah. And in fact, some centuries after Christ, there's a Jewish rabbi, Maimonides is the name, and you're not going to find like a set of dogmatic principles that are Jewish, necessarily. They don't have that. And I'm talking about, after Christ. The closest you'll get is this Maimonides created a list of, I think, 12 principles that are necessary in order for one to be a Jew. And one of them is awaiting the Messiah. But now you come fast forward to our day, and, this is what it is, just a mere 20% at most. And a good number of the others, they think they're the Messiah. Let's go do good works. Let's repair the world. And of course, their idea of repairing the world is transgender mutilation. So it's not really working out so well. Now, getting back to the council's push for man's autonomy, in Article 59, we find this. Culture, because it flows immediately from the spiritual and social character of man, has constant need of just liberty in order to develop. It needs also the legitimate possibility of exercising its autonomy according to its own principles. Now, does the Catholic Church, the true church, consider it legitimate to exercise autonomy according to one's own principles, apart from those that are founded in truth, even if they should directly oppose Christ? Of course not. Again, just another small example among a mountain of examples that this thing is not Catholic. This article continues. This sacred synod, therefore, recalling the teachings of the First Vatican Council, affirms the legitimate autonomy of human culture, and especially the sciences. So maybe you get a sense for where the scientism of today is getting some of its fuel. It's from this kind of nonsense. Now, the footnote to this statement in Gaudium et Spes points to De Filius of Vatican I, a specific citation, and that citation states this. Human arts and sciences, if rightly handled, lead to God by the aid of His grace. The Church does not forbid disciplines of this kind, human arts and sciences, each in its own sphere, to use its own principles and its own method. End quote. Now, notice the qualifier that the First Vatican Council gives. Yeah, God's grace, if handled rightly, right? At this point, for those who might think that despite that, this citation sounds like a legitimate citation, De Filius continues in this very same sentence to say this, but although recognizing this freedom, the Church continually warns them not to fall into errors by opposition to divine doctrine. End quote. So the point that the First Vatican Council is making is obviously very clear to us, but what I want to point out mainly in sharing this with you is the idea that the captains of Vatican Council II, they chose to truncate the citation that they provided. They eliminated the church's role in calling the human arts and sciences to account for their duty toward the doctrine of God. They chose to do this.
They're hoping no one actually reads the footnote, huh?
Exactly.
Just trust us. Just it's from Vatican I. It's from just.
Yeah, trust me, bro. That's the expression that you hear people say, right?
Exactly.
But it's true, and the thing that it demonstrates is just the sneakiness. I mean, look, this is not an operation. This so-called sacred synod. It's not being guided by the Holy Ghost, because you have this kind of subterfuge and this disingenuousness where it's even cutting sentences in half in order to make whatever point they choose to make. It's a terrible thing. It's something that the church does not do under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that's for sure. Now, to be thorough here, because I don't want anybody accusing us of also cherry picking through the text, let's note that after affirming the legitimate autonomy of human culture and especially of the sciences, Gaudium and Spes goes on to say this: yet these movements must be penetrated by the spirit of the gospel and protected against any kind of false autonomy. Now, if you just breeze right through that, it sounds kind of Catholic, doesn't it? But it's important to note that the spirit of the gospel that the council says must penetrate these movements in order to avoid a false autonomy, well, this naturally includes reverence for Christ the King, the divine lawgiver who speaks through the church. Apart from teaching this, the council is merely giving lip service to this notion that there might be such a thing as a false autonomy. Now, that said, though, what exactly is the spirit of the gospel? That's my question. The spirit of the gospel? Where did that phrase even come from? The church is charged with preaching the gospel, not just some Cliff Notes version thereof, or some subjective spirit of the gospel. Now, if this reminds you of the spirit of Vatican II, there's a good reason for that. Because these things are open-ended and malleable, and they can become whatever the heck you want them to become, especially if you're willing to quote sacred scripture out of context and twist it and misappropriate it, which is an art form that Jorge Bergoglio had perfected. Text goes on in Article 59 to make another statement that, again, at first glance, it looks kind of like it's placing some guardrails on autonomy. It reads, quote, man can freely search for the truth, and in this case, they're referring to scientific truth, within the limits of morality and the common utility. But once again, you have to note here, the crucial part that's missing here is the traditional teaching concerning the unique role of the Catholic Church in determining and teaching in the name of its founder and head, Christ the King, the limits of morality according to the divine doctrine. And so the takeaway is that if there are any limits at all on the so-called legitimate autonomy of human culture and the sciences, those limits will be decided upon by the most influential secular leaders of the day, apart from the church. That's the takeaway here. And so that might call to mind how the council did the same thing in Dignitatis Humanae with respect to its treatment of religious liberty. Viewers might recall that it failed to define what just public order is and what due limits are, thereby leaving it to the state to decide what they are, apart from the church. Well, in Gaudium et Spes, it gets even worse. It's even worse than that, as we're going to see in just a minute. Continuing in this Article 59, the council even states with regards to this supposedly legitimate autonomy, this is stunning to me, quote, man can express his opinion and publish it. He can practice any art he chooses. Finally, he can avail himself of true information concerning events of a public nature, end quote. Now, bear well in mind that this is after the council already failed to insist upon the church's role in calling man to account for his duties towards God, the author of divine doctrine and the lawgiver who makes known the limits imposed by authentic morality. And so this is how contemporary culture has come to be so polluted with so much filth in the name of freedom of speech, which includes all manner of disgusting opinions and outright lies that are published and disseminated. How is man to avail himself of true information in an environment like this, where man is free to express his opinion and publish it without any qualification at all, right? But this is the environment we're living in, Kevin, where misinformation, disinformation, whatever label you want to put on it. It's very difficult to know when you're reading a news piece or a report of any kind what's true and what's nonsense, right? And
I think back in the day there should have been. I think there still should be some sort of punishment for spreading misinformation or disinformation. And I mean, maybe not by the state necessarily, but I mean, especially when it comes to people like you and me, or people who are writing about church matters or faith, or it's something to do with, the state of souls. It's a big deal when you're stating something wrong or something contrived or something that is, misrepresenting Christ's words or the words of the church. I mean, that's a big problem. I mean, of course you don't have a freedom to do that. I mean, you don't have freedom of speech. It's so interesting. I think I mentioned this last time we talked about this article, how it really does have that weird kind of connection with that American libertarianism.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there really is no such thing as a freedom of speech, of course. But like you said, I mean, it will be the state. It'll be the powerful, the wealthy who get to tell us what is true and what isn't, what's acceptable and what's not, what can be published, what needs to be suppressed. That's what happens when you subtract the church's role in being the voice of Christ, the King who reigns over every society. That's exactly what we get.
Wait, socialism doesn't work, Louis? Really?
Evidently. Well, it hasn't worked yet. It hasn't worked yet because we haven't.
Sometime. Let's give it some time.
We haven't tried it hard enough, I think. Now, this conciliar mindset that man has an open-ended right to express and publish as he wishes. It also dovetails with this explosion that we've seen in recent decades of pornographic media, right? Even to the point where it's streamed or otherwise delivered into homes everywhere, even those with small children. You have to constantly be on guard for it.
YouTube, Louis. I've said it many times. I formed this channel, Catholic Family Podcast, and as the day I made it, the front page was filled with women in bikinis. Now, channel, again, titled Catholic Family Podcast. I had never viewed a single video. Obviously, I wouldn't view those anyway, but so it had nothing to do with anything I'd ever searched. It was just probably because I put in my name as a man and my age at 30. And so she's like, okay, here you go. But yeah, exactly.
30-year-old man.
Yeah, and they could be sending that to kids too. It is. You're totally right. It's disturbing, disgusting.
Well, you could have been a 10-year-old kid just typing in, I'm a 30-year-old.
Yeah, right.
Nobody cares.
Right.
So the council also said, recall, man can practice any art he chooses. Again, no mention of the church's rights and prerogatives, no guardrails, no nothing. And this opened the way for the dissemination of all manner of vile insults against Christ and Our Lady, both in writing and what is mislabeled art. Some of it is truly disgusting.
It's some stuff they publish in the Vatican, Louis.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be real. I mean, some of the stuff they publish. I went to the Vatican museums so a couple of years ago now, and I'm not kidding. So you walk through the Vatican museums, and obviously there's beautiful stuff. Thousands of years of incredible art, but then they had a section that was modern, and I'm not kidding. My wife and I literally ran through it because it wasn't just like, oh, this is kind of bad. It was like it's demonic. It's demonic. I dare anyone to go there, go to the modern section at the Vatican, tell me it's not demonic. It's demonic. It's from Satan for sure.
Which only makes sense insofar as that's the headquarters of the conciliar church that's delivered to us a document like the one that we're talking about. Now, viewers will recall just a moment ago, I said the Gaudium et Spes is even worse than Dignitatis Humanae in relinquishing the church's prerogatives. The reason why I say that is in the Declaration on Religious Freedom, it's implied that the state alone has the authority to determine what the due limits are on religious freedom. And ostensibly, it has the sole authority to promote what it constitutes to be just public order. But in Gaudium et Spes, it's worse, because that authority with respect to culture and science is explicitly handed over in this case. The document states this: as for public authority, it is not its function to determine the character of the civilization, but rather to establish the conditions and to use the means which are capable of fostering the life of culture among all. So, check out the prevailing culture in nations like the United States. or Great Britain, or maybe that godforsaken cauldron of feverish diabolical activity known as the modern state of Israel, just to name a few nations. And what do you see? Well, you see gay pride parades, you see organized events calling for abortion on demand, gay marriages, the transgender mutilation of adolescents, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly what happens when the public authority is unmoored from the sovereign rights of Christ the King, and it's left to independently establish whatever conditions it deems suitable. So we're living the results of this council in large measure throughout the world. In Article 44, the council says that the church receives, quote, a variety of helps from men of every rank and condition, unquote, even those outside of the church. This article goes on to say, whoever promotes the human community at the family level, culturally, in its economic, social, and political dimensions, contributes greatly to the church as well, to the extent that she depends on things outside herself, end quote. Well, actually, ladies and gentlemen, the church, although she carries out her mission amid all manner of circumstances that are beyond her control, she has all that she needs within herself to accomplish the purpose for which she was established. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode. This is what it means when the preconciliar popes teach repeatedly, as they did, that the church is a perfect society. That's the traditional teaching that the council plainly denies by saying that she depends on things outside of herself. No, she does not depend on things outside of herself. In the next article, we find even more nonsense. This is Article 45. It states, while helping the world and receiving many benefits from it, the church has a single intention, that God's kingdom may come, and that the salvation of the whole human race may come to pass. End quote. Again, we see the suggestion that maybe all are saved. Maybe all are saved, that the salvation of the human race may come to pass. Is it really going to come to pass that all are saved and hell is empty? No, I say no, that's not a Catholic idea. As for the intention that God's kingdom may come, there's something good and right about that, because there's an eschatological dimension to the Lord's Prayer when he says, thy kingdom come. So that's fair enough, but one notes that the council couldn't bring itself to say in any of the 16 documents that are produced that the Catholic Church is the kingdom of Christ on earth, here present, right now. The kingdom of Christ is here. In its section on marriage, the text states in Article 47. More stunningness, Kevin, so hold on to your chair. In certain parts of the world, problems resulting from population growth are generating concern. In Article 87, it says this, those peoples who, besides facing so many other difficulties, likewise undergo pressures due to a rapid increase in population. It goes on, governments undoubtedly have rights and duties within the limits of their proper competency regarding the population problem in their respective countries.
Governments do?
Oh, yeah, well,
What?
So, I'm sure viewers are remembering now, probably at this very moment, that Francis in 2015 took a swipe at large families. And he said, quote, some people believe that, pardon my language, in order to be good Catholics, we should be like rabbits. And he was talking about large families with many children. Now, never mind the arrogance of knowing that his choice of words were offensive, and yet he spoke them anyway. One might wonder where he got such an idea. Well, it seems pretty reasonable to me to say that it comes, at least in part, from this council that spoke about increasing birth rates as a population problem, one that creates difficulties, right?
Well, and that's incredible too, right? Because we know for a fact now that was never a problem, like factually, and now the problem is that we have a severe decline in birth rate. So it's not even just immoral and unimaginably un-Catholic. It's wrong. It's factually wrong. And so, I guess if you want to say the one place in the world that is actually, replacing its dying people is in Africa. And do they have some cultural issues? Okay, yeah, sure. But the issue is not the birth rate. That's insane. What again, like you said, Louis, hold on to your seats. That's nuts.
Yeah. How do you reconcile what the council's saying here with the Lord's exhortation, be fruitful and multiply? These things are opposed to one another. you know? And that's a good point that you make, that in some places like parts of Asia and Europe, replacement birth rate's not there. It's leading
Not
to problems
close.
of an aging
Yeah.
population. It's a real problem. So this leads us right into the council's discussion on marriage, which has its own stunning commentary. In Article 48, after pledging to, quote, present certain key points of church doctrine, we read this: God himself is the author of matrimony, endowed as it is with various benefits and purposes. By their very nature, the institution of matrimony itself and conjugal love are ordained for the procreation and education of children, and find in them their ultimate crown, end quote. Now, this statement that I just read, it can be a little bit confusing if we don't look at it carefully. And to understand the gravity of it, we need to do exactly that. And the first thing that I would point out is that, contrary to what some people might think, conjugal love does not specifically refer to the conjugal act. These are not one and the same thing. The very next sentence in Article 48 gives us a pretty decent working definition of what's meant by conjugal love. And it reads as follows: thus, a man and a woman who by their compact of conjugal love are no longer two but one flesh, render mutual help and services to each other through an intimate union of their persons and of their actions. As a mutual gift of two persons, this intimate union and the good of the children impose total fidelity on the spouses. Unquote. The definition of conjugal love continues in Article 49, where the council says this: this love is an eminently human one, since it is directed from one person to another through an action of the will, special ingredients and signs of the friendship distinctive of marriage, providing itself by gentle affection. Unquote. And so, with this definition of conjugal love in mind, if we go back and we read Gaudium et Spes according to that definition, we can properly understand it to say this: matrimony itself and the mutual help and service of spouses, the affection and friendship distinctive of marriage, are ordained for the procreation and education of children. As a mutual gift of two persons, this intimate union and the good of children, and so on. Now, why is this so important? Why am I spending so much time on it? Well, because if you're paying attention, you'll notice that insofar as matrimony is concerned, according to the council, the mutual help of the spouses, the friendship and the gentle affection between them, these come before the procreation and the education of children. It even comes before the good of the children. And so this is yet another example of the council's rupture with the church's traditional teaching, which states this, quote, the primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Its secondary end is mutual help and the allaying of concupiscence. And that exact quote's taken from the 1917 Code of Canon Law. It's the same Code of Canon Law that was in effect as the council met. Now, to be certain, this teaching isn't just a matter of law. It was a matter of doctrine. In his encyclical on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, Pope Pius XI repeated the same teaching verbatim, and he expounds upon it. The primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. And then the Holy Father went on to add that there are these secondary ends of marriage as well, which are, quote, mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider so long as they are subordinated to the primary end. So the Holy Father here couldn't have been clearer. The secondary ends of marriage are not to be subordinated to the primary end. The council, however, effectively does exactly that. So we've already considered a couple of examples, but there's more. In Article 49, we read this: authentic conjugal love will be more highly prized and wholesome, public opinion created about it, if Christian couples give outstanding witness to the fullness and harmony in their love and to their concern for educating their children also. Again, notice the ordering of things. Conjugal love, that is the mutual help and friendship and affection of the spouses, it's given priority over educating children. Article 50, we read, marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordained toward the begetting and educating of children. Children are really the supreme gift of marriage and contribute very substantially to the welfare of the parents. Parents should regard as their proper mission the task of transmitting human life and educating those whom it has transmitted. Now, This immediately followed up in the text is immediately followed up in Article 51 that looks to me like a certain disclaimer. Marriage, to be sure, is not instituted solely for procreation. So, looking back, at first glance, read in isolation, it might appear to some people as a reiteration of the traditional teaching, but don't be fooled, it's not. Note that in the latter citation, the council states that the task of transmitting human life and educating is the proper mission of parents. What it does not say is that this is the proper mission of spouses. These are very different. If one's already a parent, of course, educating that child and transmitting human life is a proper mission. But nowhere does the council teach that there is even such a thing as a primary end of marriage, much less secondary ends.
It'd be interesting, Louie, and maybe I'll just find this for the comments. I really wonder what the difference in family size a Catholic family would have been between now and 19, when was this? 1967. That would just be interesting to watch, to see a chart, because I'm sure unquestionably there is a connection where the family size has fallen off a cliff since 1967. And again, it's one of those interesting things, we say it over and over, how it's connected, and it just makes sense then. I mean these things, you kind of, if you read it all together as like a, one text, you can probably easily miss these things. But when you actually look at them piece by piece and start to actually think about them and see how, they actually changed the meaning, right? They actually changed the, what comes first, and that matters. So that clearly matters. And I bet you can see that. I bet you it'd be pretty quick. I bet you pretty quickly you see a drop off in the amount of children had by Catholic families in the 1960s. That's again, I'll have to try to see if I can find that when we publish this in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that you're correct. And part of what is going on here as the council is meeting and deliberating this text, this 1965, the Commission on Birth Control was meeting at that moment in time to deliberate whether or not Catholics would be allowed to use contraception, which in itself is a scandal. It's the analogy that I draw is it's like your teenage son comes to you and wants to know if he can shoot heroin in the den, next to the family room. And dad says, well, son, I'm going to get together with some other parents and we'll talk about it and I'll let you know our decision. No, it doesn't work that way. But there's no question that your examination is going to prove to be correct. The council they totally avoided teaching what every bishop involved in these conciliar sessions knew very well. And that's that there is a primary end to marriage and there are secondary ends. And the primary ends are not to be subordinated to the secondary ends. And yet those phrases don't appear anywhere in the text at all. And I would say it's not even wholly accurate to say that the council lumps together the primary and the secondary ends. Rather, as we know, the primacy is actually given to the latter. Because stating that marriage is ordained toward the beginning of and the education of children, and that this is the proper mission of parents, this is not the same as what the church had always taught about the primary and the secondary ends of marriage that we already discussed. Now, even though he's often praised for issuing Humanae Vitae and ruling against the use of contraceptions, Paul VI, not surprisingly, quoted Gaudium et Spes on this matter directly. And he added his own emphasis on secondary ends by speaking of, quote, the unitive significance and the procreative significance of the marriage act. Elsewhere in Humanae Vitae, he once again spoke of the unitive and the procreative in relation to marriage. In that order. Unitive comes first. The mutual help of the spouses, their affection. The procreative aspect, that's secondary. And so with this, one might wonder why any of the council bishops, who very obviously knew the teaching as they met, and Paul VI himself, why they were even tempted to downplay, if not totally reverse, the ends of marriage. Well, the short answer here is going to be a familiar one. It's ecumenism. The Anglicans had begun permitting birth control in 1930. And this is the same year in which Pius XI promulgated Casti Connubii that we've already quoted from. And from that time up until the time of the council, contraception grew in acceptance throughout much of the Protestant world in general. And by permitting birth control, the Protestants had clearly chosen to give pride of place in marriage to the mutual help of spouses, their affection, the so-called unitive, even to the exclusion of the procreation of children. And so for the church to continue stressing the primary end of marriage as precisely this, well, this would have created what the ecumenists would have considered a so-called obstacle to Christian unity, right? So that's why, we mentioned this in the introduction. Ecumenism was a driving force for just about everything this council did.
Sorry, just real quickly, I just think it's interesting how you say, it's the exclusion of procreation. And I just think that it's interesting to see how that has continued on to be not just the exclusion of procreation, it's come to be abortion, right? It's come to be, not only do we want the marital act to be hindered and to not create life, we want to be able to actually end life. And it shows you how diabolical it is. I mean, if you end this, this primary reason, for marriage and for the marriage act, it's diabolical. And we see again, clearly by its fruits, we see that now that it ends up in, we will do anything. We will murder, we will kill babies if it means that we can have, our conjugal rights.
Yeah, it's a great point, Kevin. And I agree wholeheartedly that stressing the unitive over the procreative, that paved the way for abortion. And so, Paul VI, he gets a lot of credit for Humanae Vitae, but I would say to you, it's not the solution. It's part of the problem, because he too abandoned Catholic doctrine in the process. So moving on here, the council seems to be at pains to placate feminists and its treatment of marriage by avoiding at all costs the biblical teaching found in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Now, that scripture verse doesn't appear in either the text itself or anywhere in the footnotes for that matter. But guess which one does appear in the footnotes, albeit not in the text in any meaningful way? 2 verses later, Ephesians 5:25. This appears in the footnotes. And it says, husbands, love your wives, as Christ also loved the church and delivered himself up for it. So it seems that the council is going out of its way to stress the notion that husband and wife constitute what would be considered co-heads of the household. For example, in Article 50, it says that husband and wife will, quote, fulfill their task with human and Christian responsibility when they make decisions by common counsel and effort, end quote. Now, don't get me wrong, husbands aren't exhorted to be bullies, obviously. Being head of the household and final decision maker in matters that are going to affect the entire family, well, this doesn't preclude a husband from conferring with his wife. In fact, he would be wise to do that. But note, however, that the council is pretty clear in Article 50. They, the spouses, demonstrate their so-called Christian responsibility by making decisions together. I'm sorry, I reject that. In Article 52, it gets even worse, saying the family, to achieve the full flowering of its life and mission, needs the kindly communion of minds and the joint deliberation of spouses. End quote. Now, there's no room in these citations for the father and the husband who leads as head of his household. And at times, let's be honest, we have to make difficult and unpopular decisions for the good of our families. That just, everyone's not going to agree. Lastly, I want to point out, looking back from our perspective 60 years later, this is something that I think a number of viewers will find kind of surprising. And what you're going to see are the seeds that blossomed into what we now call globalism. Okay, this looming ominous threat. Article 83 says, it is absolutely necessary for countries to organize together international bodies and to work tirelessly for the creation of organizations which will foster peace. End quote. Again, it's repetitive, but how does the world attain peace? Well, we all know the Catholic answer at this point, right? It's recognizing, upholding our duty to Christ the King. Article 84 says this, organizations of the international community, for their part, must make provision for men's different needs. Already existing international and regional organizations are certainly well deserving of the human race. end quote. And so this calls to mind Paul VI's speech to the United Nations in October of 1965. Just as the fourth and final session of Vatican II, the one that approved Gaudium et Spes, was taking place. Speaking at the UN, Montini said this, quote, "People turn to the United Nations as if it were their last hope for peace and harmony," end quote. Now, this is a supposed pope after Pius XI promulgated Quas Primas, making it plain that man's last hope for peace will not be attained when mankind places its hope in some international organization of men, but rather when men and nations take upon themselves what he called the sweet and saving yoke of Christ the King. Importantly, the articles in Gaudium et Spes that I just shared with you, calling for international bodies for the purpose of promoting social justice and establishing peace, these are not to be understood as mere charitable organizations. Okay? In Article 79, the Council describes the nature of the organizations that it envisions, and it reads as follows: "As long as the danger of war remains, and there is no competent and sufficiently powerful authority at the international level," and it goes on. So did you get that? What the council is envisioning here, and indeed they deem it necessary, is an international organization with what it calls sufficiently powerful authority. Okay, so these, my friends, are the seeds of globalism, and organizations like the World Economic Forum, which, as viewers may recall, received numerous messages of encouragement from Francis over the course of his tenure as CEO of Man Church, right? His predecessor, however, Benedict XVI, who is widely hailed by many as the most conservative and tradition-minded of all of the post-conciliar putative popes, he didn't send even one message to the World Economic Forum, the WEF. What he did was even worse. It was even worse because he chose to lend the weight of an alleged papal encyclical, in this case, the 2009 document Caritatis in Veritate, to state this: "There is a strongly felt need for a reform of the United Nations and likewise of economic institutions so that the concept of the family of nations can acquire real teeth." Real teeth. So this is what the council's call for international organization with sufficiently powerful authority looks like. A UN and other international organizations with real teeth. This is Benedict interpreting and putting into play the teachings of Vatican II.
I mean, aren't they just admitting that they don't have the authority of God? It just really strikes me, Louis, through this whole series that, as you said, it's not actually that vague. Don't they just kind of admit through all of this that they're not the Catholic Church? They are not, the Church of Christ. They don't have Christ behind them, with them, above them, however you want to say it. I mean, that seems kind of clear. It's actually kind of amazing when you go through this entire series, which we're coming to an end to. It's actually really clarifying. I mean, I never doubted that, but I think it's really nice because you really see it's like they don't even pretend. They don't pretend to be. As you say, look at that. They're saying, hey, let's bring on worldly institutions. You're the Catholic Church. You're the Church of Christ. What are you talking about, the UN? But I think that's. I hope people who watch this see this. They admit it. They're telling you they don't have Christ.
No question. Right. And even worse than, making it plain that they don't necessarily believe that they have any authority. They're telling us that Christ has no authority, that he does not reign as king. He does not. They certainly don't believe it. At the time that Benedict called for economic institutions with real teeth, to put it in perspective on a timeline, the World Economic Forum at that point had just celebrated its 18th anniversary. And at that time, it was the most recognizable and prominent international economic institution in the world. And certainly Benedict knew that. He was worldly enough to know that. It was nearly 2 decades old at that point. 6 months before Benedict XVI promulgated Caritatis in Veritate, the WEF launched its so-called Global Redesign Initiative, which has since matured or devolved, as the case may be, into what it calls the Great Reset. But wait, it gets even worse. Believe it or not, it gets worse. In the same so-called encyclical, Benedict XVI actually stated, get this, there is urgent need of a true world political authority. In other words, Benedict XVI this faithful son of the council, he insisted that a need exists in the world for a world authority that has dominion over every nation on earth, and to which all societies, both large and small, are beholden.
Can you imagine Pius V or Pius X or any other true pope saying something like that? Just
Of
people,
course not.
please, anyone listening to this, please just put yourself in the position in history and just an actual pope saying that. How insane that is.
Yeah, it's stunning. I mean, and even a theologian that was hell-bent on floating ideas like this would be called to Rome and put in his place and made to correct what he had written because of the dangers that it poses. And so at this, Kevin, we're at the end of Gaudium et Spes and the end of our series on these documents of Vatican II. And I think at this point, anyone who's just, sat through this entire episode is going to be hard pressed to deny the Vatican Council II elevated man in the place of Christ the King. I mean, if that could be like the one short way in which we could sum up the effects of Vatican Council II, the dethronement of Jesus Christ and putting man in his place.
Well, Louie, you've done a fantastic job. As I've said many times, I greatly appreciate the efforts you went to, and I do truly believe this will be a series that stands the test of time. You will have many people to go to this in the next decades, perhaps, and hopefully to find the truth. Find what actually happened and to make their own decisions. And I think that I think you would agree with Saint Bernadette that our job is not to convince but to inform. And you've done a great job of that, to give them the information. And now the people watching can make their own minds, and decide and determine that this cannot be the Catholic Church. And if you've watched all of these episodes, I don't know how you could believe that. But if anyone's, if you want more information, I highly recommend you going to novasodawatch.org. That's a great place to start. There's so much information there. Mario is a good friend of both of ours, and he's just got it's so much information. It's going to take you years to go through it, but really the best stuff. I also recommend cmri.org. They can also give you some traditional churches, some mass times where you can attend the traditional Latin Mass, where you don't have to worry about any of this. They do not follow the supposed Pope in Rome, etc. If you have any questions for me, not likely, but maybe you do, you can reach me at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Again, Louie is over at akacatholic.com. You can also check out his ongoing series right now in January of 2026, covering the words of Leo XIV and his interpretation of Vatican II, which is fascinating in itself. And Louie and I plan to do here in the coming weeks a live show, probably live, maybe recorded, probably live, because that adds a little bit of a nice twist to it. People can ask their own questions and whatnot, perhaps with a priest as well, to just kind of do a wrap up of the entire series. Kind of like, what did we do? What was all that we just talked about? And I think that'd be a lot of fun. I think Louie's on board with that. And again, speaking for myself, thanks so much, Louie, for the time you've spent on this. It's been a pleasure for me. It's been mind-blowing, sincerely mind-blowing. Every episode has just been something new that just really, truly blows my mind. I don't know, in a good way, in a bad way, I suppose, but in a way that clarifies that the way I practice my faith is the right way. And Vatican II really, really ruined the world. I mean, I really think a lot of the errors you see in the world today come from this council. Enough said on my side. Everyone, please stay tuned to the channel. If you haven't already, subscribe so that you can check out our live show coming up soon. And please share it. Share this with your family and friends so that they can get to know this stuff as well. Louie, again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon. And we look forward to all the content that you will have to come. And we, as you know, you are always, always welcome on the Catholic Family Podcast. God bless you.
Thank you, Kevin. It was a great opportunity, and I appreciate it. If anybody received any help from this, we're in honor to God. Thanks for having me.